Well, welcome everybody. We're really glad to have you participating in our webinar today, all about the Caribbean Waterbird Census, how to participate, the basics and more. And this will be presented today by myself. I'm Lisa Sorensen, the Executive Director of Birds Caribbean, and also Jessica Canizares. She's our Waterbird Program Manager. And then we are very fortunate to have with us today Adrienne Tosses, and she is the president of Birds Caribbean, and she's helping out with closed caption translation. So if you could use some Spanish translation, be sure to check that out. It should be available on the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A panel of your Zoom. And also feel free to introduce yourself or make any comments in the chat window. We'll be monitoring that as well. And welcome to everybody on Facebook. If you're watching from Facebook, we'll try to keep an eye on that as well if you have questions or comments there. So without further ado, we shall get going. Everybody's going to be muted, and then we'll ask Jessica and Adriana to maybe close your video because that might be taking up space on the Zoom window. I'm not sure. So let's try that. All right, so here we go. All right, so just a little bit of background first to get us started in case you're not familiar with Birds Caribbean. I think a lot of people are, but anyway, we are a regional nonprofit and we're dedicated to the conservation of Caribbean birds and their habitats throughout all the islands of the Caribbean. And together with our partners, we raise awareness and we promote sound science, and we try to empower local partners and communities and citizens to build a region where people appreciate and conserve and benefit from thriving bird populations and ecosystems. So we are all about building capacity. We develop regional conservation projects and activities and materials, and then we share them throughout the islands. We do a lot of outreach and education. We really believe strongly in educating youth and decision makers and community members, you know, trying to reach everybody about the beauty and value of birds and nature. We support and we encourage science. So we have some curricula, such as the BirdsCaribbean curricula, which teaches kids about science. We have a journal, the Journal of Caribbean Ornithology, to encourage people to publish their scientific studies. And then we offer a lot of training workshops and small grants for our partners to do their work. So training in bird education curricula, Caribbean Waterbird Census monitoring, bird guide training, things like that. So what we try to do throughout all of our work is make bird conservation a positive, both culturally and economically. So in today's presentation, there will be two parts. Part one will be how to participate in the CWC. So we will be covering what are waterbirds, what are wetlands, why is the Caribbean Waterbird Census important, how to participate, where, when, and how to count waterbirds, and then resources to help you carry out your counts. And then in part two, Jessica will take over in that section. She'll give us an overview on what we've learned from the first 10 years of this Caribbean Waterbird Census. We're now going on our 12th year, so we're excited to share with you some of our CWC results and outcomes from over 10 years of these surveys. So now I have a little poll for you. I would like to know, have you participated in the CWC? If this is your first time doing a CWC, fill in A. Put B if you've participated in 1 to 10 counts in the past. Put C if you've participated in more than 10 to 20 counts, and then D if you participated in more than 20 counts. So that means you've probably been doing counts for more than 1 year. So please just go ahead and put that in the chat box, and that will just give us some idea of your level of experience, and it helps us to gauge how to give this presentation. So great, I see lots of A's and B's, which is great. A couple of D's, some people that are more experienced. So that's awesome. Thanks for answering. Sorry, I can't find these. The first time this happened to me, I'm not sure what happened to the poll bar. Anyway, we will continue. All right, so what are waterbirds? Well, you probably have a pretty good sense of what waterbirds are. They're birds that depend on or live in wetlands. So that would include like all the herons and egrets that we're familiar with, pelicans, cormorants, anhingas, flamingos, ducks, marsh birds like rails and jacanas, and then seabirds like oyster catchers, stilts, plovers, sandpipers, and shorebirds. And seabirds like terns and gulls, and then of course shorebirds like oyster catchers, stilts, plovers, and sandpipers. Okay, and what are wetlands? Well, in the Caribbean Waterbird Census, we use the Ramsar Convention definition, which is quite a mouthful. I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. It's wetlands are areas of marsh, fen, peatland, or water, whether natural, artificial, permanent, or temporary, with water that is static or flowing, fresh, brackish, or salt, including areas of marine water, the depth of which at low tide does not exceed 6 meters. Phew. So basically, it's anywhere with water, the place that can hold water. So beaches, mudflats, sand flats, salt ponds, lagoons, and then even man-made structures like reservoirs and sewage treatment plants can be considered wetlands for our purposes, and you can conduct a count there. So let's take a look at some typical wetland site areas. So we have mangroves. This is very typical in the Caribbean. Lots of areas with mangroves on the coastline. You might have some smaller, large ponds. You know, these could be, you know, watering holes for livestock. They could be man-made. They could be natural. They may hold water just part of the year, or they may go dry for many months or even years. But as long as they, at some point in time, hold water, you know, with enough rainfall, they are considered wetlands. We also have a lot of mud flats and sand flats. Often these are areas near mangroves, and these will attract different species of birds. Swamps are areas definitely that typically have a lot of wooded vegetation and trees. You can have marshes. These have typically sedges and cattails, bulrushes, and reeds. So you can get ducks dabbling at the fringes, and coots and rails and shoreline vegetation. And then you also have beaches and marine water. So these are also considered wetlands according to the Ramsar definition. So birds are going to be, some birds are generalists and they might use all these habitats, but quite a few birds are more specialists, and you'll only see them in certain kinds of habitats. So you'll have shorebirds typically at the beach and in mud flats, but you won't see them in ponds with deep water because the water's too deep for them to dip down into the mud and find food. But in deeper ponds, you'll find species like ducks and grebes, which can dive for their food. All right, so birds need Caribbean wetlands. We have, our Caribbean wetlands support about 185 species of waterbirds, the different groups of birds that I've mentioned, and 126 of which are aquatic and terrestrial neotropical migrants. So this means that they nest up north in the temperate and Arctic and subarctic areas, and then they migrate to the Caribbean either to spend the winter or as stopover as they move further south. And almost 1/3 of these are species of conservation concern. So this includes species like the piping plover and the red knot. And generally, a lot of water birds are declining, especially shorebirds. And so these are getting a lot of attention lately with grants and studies trying to understand why shorebirds are declining and what we can do about it. Wetlands, in our wetlands, we also have Caribbean endemics, and we're really proud of our West Indian whistling duck, which is a regional endemic that's threatened. We also have the Zapata rail, which is endemic to Cuba. It hasn't been seen in many years and may be extinct. Hopefully not, but there's been some searches for the species in recent years and nobody has seen it lately. And then you also have species like red-shouldered blackbirds, which is another endemic, which could be considered a wetland species since it occurs there. And there's many other facultative wetland species that use wetlands as well as other habitats. And that includes a lot of warblers and migratory landbirds. So the Caribbean region is well known as having very important habitat for waterbirds. There are 42 Ramsar sites. These are sites that are designated of international importance, wetlands of international importance. There are 294 important bird areas, IBAs, throughout the Caribbean islands that are wetlands. And then we also have 2 WISRN sites. And these are Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network sites. One of them is in Puerto Rico, the Cabo Rojo Salt Flats. That was designated a number of years ago due to tens of thousands of migratory shorebirds that spend the winter there. And then just a couple years ago, a site was designated in Bonaire, the Cargill Salt Ponds, which is another very important area for migratory shorebirds. So the Caribbean Waterbird Census, it was launched in 2010, and the goal was to better understand the status, the distribution, the trends, and the migration patterns of our waterbirds, both the residents and the migratory species. So some of the questions that we wanted to answer with the Caribbean Waterbird Census are: what species of waterbirds are present at the site? How are their numbers changing over time? And what environmental factors are linked to these changes? And these could be natural or human induced factors. And so we realized, back in 2010 that we really knew very little about what waterbirds are using, which habitats, what's the species diversity, how many birds are there, how are their numbers changing over time, what's threatening them. And actually there's a lot of threats to waterbirds, and we just don't have much data on what is the impact of those threats and what to do about it. So why should you get involved, and why are you here today? So it's really helpful to have you get involved because it'll help us to learn more about wetlands and our wetland birds. And the more we can learn about our water birds, this will help us to increase awareness and support amongst decision makers and wildlife managers and community leaders and educators and the public and youth to take action to conserve wetlands of importance to migratory and resident birds. So who can participate? Well, we have a lot of individuals and volunteers that participate. We have school groups that participate. We have NGOs like National Trusts and NGOs like Environmental Awareness Group, Sustainable Grenadines Inc., Science, and others that participate. We have government agencies like National Environment Planning Agency in Jamaica that participate and lead censuses, and you. So everyone is welcome to join the census and help us out with gathering this data. So when does the CWC take place? Well, we're getting ready to start our 2021 CWC on, on January 14th. And this is a 3-week count period in the winter. And this is when most birds are stationary on the landscape. So it kind of gives us a snapshot of where birds are on the landscape during the winter when they're not moving around very much. And so it'll give us a good count of where birds are distributed, how many there are during their winter stay in the Caribbean. But it's super important to do Caribbean waterbird census counts at other times of the year too, particularly doing migration to capture arrivals and departures of migrants that are moving through the islands. So you might think about doing some counts in the spring from March to May, in the summer from June to August, and in the fall during bird migration. So actually for birds, especially for example, birds maybe that have not breeded successfully, they will start migrating as early as July. So we can start seeing migrants showing up in the Caribbean in July, which is pretty amazing. But August migration really picks up, and I would say the peak of migration is in September and October, maybe the first half of October. And then for spring migration, it's probably, they're getting ready to migrate in March, but most migration will happen in April and May. So we encourage you to do counts as often as you can. So what bird species should be included in the CWC? This is another little mini quiz. So if you'll write in the chat window, which species you think should be included. A, wading birds, seabirds, shorebirds, and marshbirds. B, songbirds. C, ospreys and belted kingfishers, which could be considered wetland dependent species. Or D, all of the above. Just write in the chat window what you think the answer is to this question. We'll just give you a couple minutes to do that. Should we include just the typical birds that we think of water birds, or should we include others in our counts? Let us know what you think. Don't worry, nobody's being graded for marks. All right, so if you said D, that is the correct answer. In the CWC, as in when we do any birding in eBird, we strongly encourage you to record all birds that you're able to identify by sight or sound, and not just waterbirds. So in other words, do what we call a complete checklist of the birds at your site. And the reason to do this is that it greatly increases the value of your checklist to science. When you enter your data on eBird, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that later if you're not familiar with eBird, but it's an app that you can have on your phone and also on your desktop computer. And it allows you to keep checklists of all the birds that you see. And this is where we keep our CWC data. One of the last questions before you submit your data is, are you submitting a complete checklist of all the birds that you were able to identify? And this includes by sight or sound. So the reason for doing that is that every single bird observation, whether it's common or rare, has value. So when you submit a complete checklist, you're telling us not only which birds you found, but also which species you did not observe. So for example, a complete checklist tells us that you didn't report any house sparrows or semi-palmated sandpipers at your site because it's not because you didn't identify or encounter them, or not because you intentionally excluded them from your list. You didn't report them. You didn't report them because they weren't there. So to scientists, knowing where birds aren't is just as important as knowing where they are. Okay, so your data will be most valuable if you include all birds in your checklist. And so do your best to be able to answer that question honestly each time you submit a bird list. And so this is birds that you see or hear and identify to the best of your ability. It doesn't mean that you maybe correctly found every bird, because that's not possible. And you could make mistakes in ID. We realize that's possible too. If you can't identify a bird, you can try to enter it as the closest bird. You can identify like sandpiper spa or duck species. You can narrow it down to what group of birds it is and enter that. So do your best to make your checklist complete every time you enter them. Okay, the other thing that we do is monitor habitats. And this is important because, of course, the condition of the habitat will influence the diversity and abundance of the birds at the site. So for example, you might have a mud flat, which when it's muddy or has a couple of inches of water, it's super productive and you've got tons of shorebirds there. But if you're in a drought, the mud might go completely dry and cracked and you might have very few birds there. So again, monitoring habitats is important because then we can relate the numbers and species that you see at your site to the conditions of the habitat. And we actually have data sheets for you to keep track of conditions of your habitat as well. And very soon, eBird is going to offer the option to include habitat conditions as part of your eBird checklist as well, which is really fantastic. We call these habitat covariates. So it's some of the other variables that influence the number of birds that you see at the site, whether it's something that's related to the habitat itself, or it could be something like weather or disturbance, pollution at the site, things like that. So of course, if it's raining and storming, you might not see a lot of birds at your site. That's a factor that influences the birds that you're going to see at the site. So what are the CWC protocols? The CWC consists of standard protocols to answer questions related to the conservation of water birds and their habitats. And in our CWC manual, and we'll share a link for you to download that if you're interested to read and study the manual. There's a lot of great information there. We talk about 4 levels of monitoring. And the one that we're focusing on today is level 1, which is doing basic CWC counts or site inventory. And that's the first level of entry into doing a Caribbean Waterbird Census. And many people just do level 1 counting, and that's fantastic. That's perfect. If you want to do more, you're welcome to do more, but level 1 is great, especially if you're new to the census and new to birding. So what are the CWC methods? There's 3 basic methods that you can use. One is called a point count, also called a stationary count. And this is where the observer stands in a fixed location and counts all the birds seen or heard in a standard period of time. So you might choose as your count time 10 minutes or 15 minutes, but you stand at your point and you count all the birds during your fixed period of time. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to stand like a rock in one place and you can't move at all. You can move around a little bit, probably 20 or 30 meters at either side if you need to see around a piece of vegetation that's obstructing you, something like that. But basically you're staying in one location to do your count. A traveling count is when you're making observations while you're traveling over a specific distance and duration. So you might be walking along a beach, you might be walking through a wetland, maybe you have a complex of wetlands, it could be on a golf course, it could be in a marsh, and you're walking around the wetlands, taking a defined path and counting all the birds that you see as you walk along this path. Maybe there's a boardwalk or a path to go around the wetland. You could call that a traveling count. And then an area search is a method that is very similar to birding. And that's where you have an area, a predefined area, and you walk through the area again in a predefined movement to try to see and count all the birds in that area. Those are the three basic methods. And we encourage you to do the point count or traveling count if you can. Those seem to be the best for data analysis with eBird. Okay, where should your counts take place? Well, you can do a count at any wetland. It can be big, it can be small, as long as it's easy and safe for you to access. You may not have the ability to travel very far. So you have a wetland near your house or a park or within town, go ahead and count that wetland. That's great. If you're fortunate to live near a national park or protected area that has an IBA or Ramsar site, or you can travel a bit to do your counts, that's great too. Do try to do counts at wetlands that have some kind of designation as an important area. So as I mentioned, wetlands that have special designations like Ramsar sites or IBAs or wizard sites. But again, there's lots of important wetlands that aren't designated as protected or have special status that are important for birds. So do a count at any wetland that you're able, one or more wetlands that you're able to access. So getting to know your site or your sites that you're going to do a count at is one of the most important things that you can do to prepare to participate in the Caribbean Waterbird Census. Sometimes birds can be hard to detect because they can easily hide behind clumps of vegetation, as shown in this one slide here, where somebody is walking through a mangrove wetland. This might be a site where you need to do a traveling count because it's impossible to see the whole wetland because you've got these big clumps of mangrove growing throughout the wetland. You might have a site like this one here in the Bahamas. This is Lake Rosa, huge salt pond. And sometimes the birds are near the levees that go around and through this lake. Sometimes they're far away. So you need to get to know your site and understand where the birds are distributed and what you're going to need to count them. Here's a couple of other examples of wetland sites in the Caribbean. One is McKinnon's Pond in Antigua. That typically, it's a large wetland. It has a lot of birds sometimes. And so you need to figure out what's the best place to do counts of this wetland. How many counts do I need to do to cover this wetland? And what are the best vantage points to see the birds? And you need to think about things like the sun. If it's rising, it should be ideally behind you, or if it's setting behind you. Staring into the sun to identify birds is really, really difficult. Really, especially at sunrise or sunset or when the sun is low in the sky, makes it really hard to make out the features of a bird when you're staring into the sun. So having the sun behind you helps a lot with bird identification. Spring Pond in Jamaica, we discovered that there were mass ducks hiding in these grasses and shoreline vegetation. So you need to be aware of where ducks might be hidden. And we discovered when we moved just a little bit down the shoreline, we were able to see these ducks right at the edge of the pond there. So you need to be aware of factors that affect your count and try to reduce these sources of bias. So those of you who have been out birding or tried to do a count, I'm sure you've experienced some of these challenges. Birds flock, they move around a lot, they can be challenging to identify. They can be visible yet really far away, making them hard to identify. Sometimes they hide in the vegetation. Often they're silent. Sometimes they're noisy. They're too noisy and they scare off other birds if they're alarmed by your presence. Sometimes they live in really dense, impenetrable habitats you can't even see in more than 10 or 20 meters to see what's there. Sometimes birds are very shy and they'll leave as soon as you show up. But then some wetland birds are easy to identify, and that's always a joy to get to an open pond that's big and be able to see everything and identify it. So it's good to keep all these challenges in mind though and be aware of them. And our goal is to do a count that is as accurate and unbiased as possible. So let me talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. These are some sources of bias or variation in the data. These are things that can influence the accuracy of your count. So sources of bias are things that we want to eliminate, and then we want to account for variation and try to reduce it as much as we can in the data that we collect. So these are some things to think about when you're planning your count and how this can affect what you're seeing at your wetland. There's factors like the time of day, the tides. Some sites are tidal. Water levels, you know, the water might be really high, it might be average, it might be low, it might be not there at all. So of course, the birds that you see at your site are gonna vary depending on the water levels. The size and the color of the bird, that influences detectability, which is, you know, your chances of detecting the bird if it's present. So one example would be, which species do you think is more detectable? The snowy egret on the bottom or the green heron on top? You can answer in the chat window. If you said snowy egret, that is correct. White birds show up really well, even far away, and they contrast against dark water or dark vegetation. On the other hand, a green heron can be just hidden in the vegetation, perfectly still. And unless you really scan the vegetation with your binoculars, you might not see it. So what we say is that the green heron has lower detectability than the snowy egret. But we want to be aware of that. We want to make sure that we're reducing factors like detectability and seeing and noticing and finding and counting all the birds that are there as much as possible. So that means having binoculars and scanning the vegetation, listening for calls. You might hear the call of the green heron, even if you don't see it. It has a really distinctive, loud scow call. And if you hear that, you know the bird is there. You can count it even without seeing it in your count. So again, these are all factors that you need to think about when doing your count. The optics that you use, the lighting, you know, 8x42 binoculars are great for doing counts at wetlands. Some sites like Great Inagua, the Lake Rosa on Great Inagua and other big wetlands, you're gonna need a spotting scope. The birds might be too far away to identify them correctly, especially shorebirds without a scope. Sometimes vegetative cover can be a problem, misidentification, the experience of the observer. You know, if somebody does a count that's really experienced versus somebody that's not experienced, you're going to get a different count. So these are all some sources of bias and variation in conducting a count. And what we want to try to do is reduce those as much as possible. So plan your counts to reduce or quantify your bias, reduce your variation, and increase the detectability of individuals or species that you want to see. Let's say, for example, that you want to study the birds at a wetland over a 4-week period. And you start out during the first 2 weeks and you go out at sunrise and you count all the birds. And then something happens with your schedule and you discovered, oh, I can't do this count in the morning anymore. My work schedule's changed. I'm going to do it now at noon at my lunch hour. And you go out for the next 2 weeks and you record the birds. It's very likely that the bird species in abundance in the counts that you conduct in the morning versus at noontime are going to be very different. So do you think it would be valid to say, gee, I have fewer birds at my site, you know, in the second 2 weeks and the first 2 weeks? Probably not. You would want to think about that and realize that birds are active in the morning. And the reason that you're not seeing as many birds is because you're counting them in the heat of the day when they're hiding. So these are all things to think about as you're planning your count and carrying it out. And you want to try to reduce that as much as possible. So if you're new to doing CWC surveys, we recommend that you do reconnaissance surveys first, get to know your sites, visit them a number of times, and think about ways to reduce the impacts from bias and variation. So think about where you can stand to do your count, where you're going to walk, and think about how you can standardize your surveys. You're going to want to do them the exact same way every time. use the same equipment, use the same observers, use the same point count stations and so forth. Do the surveys at the same time of day, at the same tidal state, if your site is tidal. Spend the same amount of time counting, things like that. Again, doing reconnaissance surveys, you want to decide on your point count stations or traveling count route. Here's an example from some wetlands in Antigua. You can see the North Pond here, what I call Coco's Pond, and then some marshes down here. And here's a road. So it might work to drive here and stop and do a point count of the north point from the road here. You might also be able to see Coco's Pond here. So that might be a point count to look at both the North Pond and Coco's Pond. Or you might decide I can do one count here, but then to cover all of Coco's Pond, I need to do a count here and maybe a count down here. And then I need to do one more count down here to get the marshes. So think about the counts that you can do to cover the entire wetland as much as possible. Or subsample it, access it at a few different points that you're able to reach. So let's see. If you're doing a traveling count, you could decide on your route. You might, you might park here and then walk over here and then walk down around the pond this way. Anyway, the point is to get to know your site and decide the best way to do the survey. And then once you've practiced it a few times and you decide it makes sense, then that's going to be your standard methodology for counting that location. And one thing to think about is what bird species are at the site. So if you guys know black-necked stilts, they're like little alarm bells. If you arrive at a site and you get out of your car, they're going to start screaming and squawking and they're going to flush all the other birds away. So you need to be aware of that too and be ready to record the birds before they flush. So you might be able to use your car as a blind to record what's there before you get out, because you do want to include birds that you might flush in your count. So again, knowing the birds, knowing the site will really help you to get an accurate count. All right, the next thing you want to do is assemble your equipment and resources and practice your count. So of course you need a pair of binoculars, you need a good field guide. Birds of the West Indies by Raphael just came out with a second edition a couple months ago. So this is a really great resource. There's also a lot of local field guides. This is a great resource for learning about shorebirds. It says beginner's guide, but it has some really great tips in it. And then of course you want to get some birding apps on your mobile phone if possible. And one really great one is the Merlin Birding ID app. And all you need to do is the app will take you through 5 questions about your bird that you don't know how to ID. And it's going to suggest to you what bird it is that you're seeing based on your description of its size, where it's located in the habitat, the time of year, your location. It works really, really well. It's pretty amazing. So if you haven't tried Merlin yet, download it and give it a try. It's super helpful. And then of course the eBird app. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more later in the talk, but this is some of your essential equipment for doing a count. Another thing you might consider is using data sheets. If you want to gather more detailed data about your count, like weather data, site conditions, and so forth, since eBird doesn't offer the ability yet to enter these kinds of data, we have CWC count forms that you can download and carry with you in the field using a clipboard or a piece of cardboard, as a clipboard, and fill out the data sheets to do your counts. And here, for example, at the bottom of the data sheet, you can record the weather. We have sky codes and wind codes, the wind direction. You can talk about other kinds of factors like the water level, what's happening with the vegetation. And these can be really important habitat variables to include in your count data to help you to understand the number and species, what factors are influencing the number and species of birds that are present at your site. All right, when should counts take place? Well, as you guys probably know, birds are most active and visible in the early morning and late afternoon. So do aim to do your count between sunrise and 10 a.m. if possible. Some of us are not early risers and it's a little bit painful to get up that early. But once you're out of bed, it's worth it. I mean, sometimes you get to see incredible sunrises, incredible sunsets like this one in Jamaica at Font Hill. And avoid the midday, because again, that's when it's hot, the birds tend to go into hiding, they're roosting, they're not active, so that's going to influence detectability. You're not going to be able to see those birds. They could be hidden in the vegetation. And then again, when doing your counts, think about where to do the counts and try to, if possible, do the counts so that the sun is behind you. You know, that might mean doing count in the evening instead of the morning to have the optimal visibility of the birds. Okay, so level 1 counts, basic counts, objectives of this count. As I said before, this level 1 counts are best for participating in the Caribbean Waterbird Census at a basic level. It'll help you to familiarize yourself with the site, develop a species list or checklist for the site. You can conduct a rapid assessment of the birds that are present, and it'll help you plan for more higher levels of monitoring if you want to do more detailed studies. You can test your count methods. It's great for training observers and for refining your skills. And again, you know, don't be hard on yourself and expect to become good at doing counts from just 1 or 2 visits. It really takes a lot of practice in the field, especially if you're fairly new to birding and doing counts. You want to practice a lot, get out there as often as possible. So a summary, you want to visit the site over a period of a year as often as possible. Use one of the CWC protocols, preferably the point count or the traveling count. For the site inventory, it's not as important to strictly follow count protocol. You know, you're really just trying to document all the species that are there, but do record all species that are seen and heard, count the number of each species, note the size of the area that you counted, and record the amount of time that you spend counting. And just a little bit about recording flocks of birds. You might have a large flocks of birds, you know, it could be 50 birds, it could be 100 birds, it could be 1,000 birds. And of course, the more birds there are, the more difficult it is to count, to do an accurate count. You know, the birds are kind of bunched up and it's hard to see all of them. So in that case, just do your best to estimate the flock size. If you have a flock of 100 birds, maybe you can count 10 and say, okay, this is what 10 birds look like. Now I'm going to multiply that and that will help you to estimate the flock size. If you have 1,000 birds, you might count, get a rough count of what 100 are, and or divide the flock into 4 and count a quarter of the flock and then multiply that by 4. So there's different ways to estimate, and we even have some practice software to help you estimate flock size. But again, if you practice and if you go out with a friend and you each do practice counts and compare your counts with each other, flock size, that can really be helpful in helping you to do good estimates of flock size. So, and again, it's better, eBird has an option to just put an X if you don't have a count of the birds, but we recommend to try to avoid putting an X there as much as possible. If you can, estimate a count. Even if you're off by hundreds of birds, it's better than an X, because an X just means you might have saw 1 bird, you might have seen 100, or you might have seen 1,000. eBird doesn't know. So if you think it's close to 100, put 100, don't put an X, you know, because that's much better data. That makes your data more rigorous. Okay, so to summarize again, plan the details, your walking route, your point count location, choose what time of day you're going to do the count, try to look at the weather and choose days where you have good weather, not too windy, not stormy. Arrive quietly and have all your equipment ready to go to do the count. Record the start time of your count, and then count all the birds you see or hear to the best of your ability. And if you're using the eBird app, that's a big help, because again, once you start the app, it's going to start your count. And if you're doing a traveling count, it's also going to record your route. It'll keep track with the GPS of where you're going, and you don't need to be connected to the internet for that to work. Take care to try to avoid double counting birds, because they might be moving about, or if you change your point count location, going from one side of the pond to the other, try to keep an eye on the birds, make sure they haven't moved over to your side of the pond again and that you're not recounting them. Keeping time of your count and your distant travel. Again, the mobile app will do that for you. And then I also strongly recommend that you take a camera with you in the field whenever you go birding. You never know when you might see a bird that you don't know how to identify. And if you have a zoom lens on your camera, just zoom in, try to get a couple of good photos of the bird. And there's lots of great birders in our network, and we're always happy to help you with bird ID. It's a fun challenge for all of us, and it's a learning exercise for all of us to identify birds from photos. So on our Facebook page or in our bird group, And we'll send you links to join, for example, our groups.io on, we have a waterbird group. That's a great place to share photos and get help with bird ID. Never guess, you know, just recognize that, hey, I'm not really sure what this is. I'm going to take a picture and I'm going to share it with my colleagues and get some help with figuring out what the bird is. And then, of course, enter your data in eBird Caribbean with the appropriate CWC protocol. So what can your data be used for? Well, your checklist can be used for conservation and management of the site. Your site, you may discover that you have rare, threatened, or endemic species of shorebirds or waterbirds or ducks at your site. And that could help, you know, elevate that site to be a site of national or regional importance. It's going to help us understand the distribution of birds over the landscape. You'll be contributing data to science. All this data that all of us are contributing to eBird is contributing to what's called eBird status and trends. I'll tell you more about that later, but eBird is using the millions and millions of observations from eBird to answer some really exciting questions and show how birds are distributed across the landscape in the Western Hemisphere, all over the world really, and how they're moving about during migration. By doing level 1 counts, you'll be able to plan more detailed surveys if you want to do a more intensive study. You can use level 1 counts to train observers. Maybe you're an experienced counter, but you want to train some school kids or some community members how to do the CWC. And as I've said before, this is the basic level of CWC monitoring, which is great for community members to participate and contribute. So one thing to know about level 1 counts, there are no measures of detectability statistically with doing a level 1 count. So you wouldn't be able to do analyses on species diversity and abundance and get estimates unless you add measures of detectability. And in the future, we might do another webinar to talk about more sophisticated levels of monitoring, levels 2, 3, and 4. But for now, we're just going to stick with level 1, basic monitoring. And here's an example of what Cornell Lab of Ornithology has been able to do with eBird data. This shows the range map of the blue-winged teal. And up here in the north, in the prairie pothole region, which is an area with the depressions, millions of depressions from the retreat of glaciers tens of thousands of years ago, has created what's called the prairie pothole area and the prairie pothole region. And this is called the duck breeding factory of North America because dozens of species of ducks come here in the spring and they nest and they have babies. And this is the major breeding area. So then after they nest in the summer, they start to migrate, and the blue shows their distribution in the winter or the non-breeding season. You can see they're distributed, you know, in wetlands along the coast, in Central America, Mexico, and then it's hard to see in the Caribbean, but blue-winged teal is our #1 duck in the region, and they're quite common at a number of our coastal wetlands and some inland wetlands as well. So this is all based on citizen science eBird data, this range map, which is really, really cool. Here's another example with a spotted sandpiper. You can see that this species breeds further north into Canada and in Alaska. And this is where the species can be seen year round. And again, this species winters a little bit more into South America, but it's also a fairly common migrant and wintering species in the Caribbean. And then this is an animation map for the short-billed dowitcher. And let me see if I can get that going. So here you can see how the birds are moving over the annual cycle, over the year. So October, November, December. Now we're back to, let's start it again. So in January and February and March, the birds are on their wintering grounds, but then during spring and summer, you can see they've moved up here to breed. And then in the fall, they're migrating back down south. And again, this is a waterbird, so it doesn't show up very well on the landscape. It's all in the coastal wetlands. But again, this is all based on eBird data, citizen science data that's able to show us these animation maps, how birds are moving from breeding grounds to wintering grounds and back again, which is really, really neat. Millions of observations go into making these status and trends maps. And you can go onto the eBird website, just Google eBird status and trends. eBird has done these abundance of animations for about over 600 species now. So it's really cool to explore some of your favorite species to see where they're wintering and migrating. All right, so just to say quickly about level 2, that's like the next level of monitoring. This includes a measure of detectability. So it would let you, what you would be doing is you would be able to estimate density and abundance because you would be adding a measure of detectability. And the way that you do that is by doing repeated counts at your site. So you might do a count 2 or 3 times in 1 week, or do 3 counts over a 10-day period. And that, if you go back to your site and do a CWC, level 1 point count 3 times, you've reached level 2. You've repeated the count, and that will allow a statistician, or yourself if you're a scientist and have the statistical know-how, to actually do an estimate of the abundance of the species at your site, or the density of the species at your wetland, if you've got measures of detectability. So it's something to think about. There's ways to assess detectability by doing repeated counts, or something that's called removal counts. This is point counts with distance sampling, or double observer. This is when you and another observer do counts and you use that as a measure of detectability. Again, we don't have time to get into this for this talk, but that could be the subject of a future talk. All right, so to summarize, following all protocols, consistency is key. You want to follow the same protocol, the same standard method every time you go out and do a count. So count birds at the same time of day, count birds at the same times of the year, avoid counting in poor weather, cover the same area and spend the same amount of time identifying species and counting them, and then count all birds each time you go out and do a count. And now we're going to switch over, and Jessica is going to talk about the next section, which is entering your data, and then some of our findings from eBird. So Jessica, go ahead, and I will do my best to advance the slides for you.
Sure, great. Can you see me?
Yes.
Great, perfect. Hi, everyone. So glad that we have 40 people attending, and really happy to see so many familiar names and also some new names on here. I hope that you all get a chance to go out for the CWC this year. Of course, remember to do it as safely as possible given the current circumstances. Both Lisa and I really wish we could be in the Caribbean with you counting birds. So I just wanted to quickly talk about entering data, and there's really 2 ways to do that. One is you could keep a list in a notebook, come back home and sign into eBird on a laptop or desktop, and then you can put in your CWC information. The other way is if you have a smartphone, you can download the eBird app, and it sort of just does everything automatically. The app is a lot easier, but if you don't have a smartphone, then you can certainly put it on the desktop. And this is super important because for us, we need the checklist to be correctly designated as CWC for us to know that they are truly CWC. And when we analyze the data and write yearly reports, we filter the eBird data by protocol type. And so if it's not correctly tagged CWC, then that information is lost to us, which is really unfortunate. So if you're new to eBird, it's free. You sign up with an account. There's even a Caribbean portal. So just go to ebird.org/Caribbean. And if you're uploading your checklist to a desktop, you enter all your location information, and then there's a page where it says observation type, and you'll see the 3 different CWC protocols there, and just choose the one for the method that you used. So a point count, an area search, or a traveling count. Then you can input all your bird information. And then next, if you're using the mobile eBird app, I highly recommend this app because it stores all the information for you. So next slide, please, Lisa. The app is great because if you've used it before, you just start checklist. It knows your location, it starts the time, the date, all that stuff is just recorded automatically. So it's pretty great. For this, for CWC protocols to be available to you, you do have to be using the eBird Caribbean portal or they won't show up. To get to this, at least on my iPhone. I know that we all have different phones, so not sure how others look, but they're sort of like on the main page in the bottom menu, there's like a dot, dot, dot more. And when I click on that, there's a settings option, and under settings, there's portal, and you can choose the eBird Caribbean portal there. And so that enables the CWC protocols to appear after you finished birding. So this is different. You start your checklist, you count all your birds, and once you click stop birding or stop track, it will ask you sort of how many observers were there and this information. And in order to access the checklists, you can see I've circled how it looks on my phone. All the checklists default to incidental, but you can see there's a little arrow next to it. And so if you just click on incidental or that arrow, a whole bunch of different observation types show up, and you'll be able to choose CWC point count or CWC traveling count. Unfortunately, area search is not available on the mobile app because there's no way to input area parameters. So if you did do an area search, you would have to use a desktop to do that. And so that covers that for apps, this is all listed on our website, and all these screenshots are there in various places. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to walk you through it. You can email myself or Lisa, but we definitely want you to tag your protocols correctly so that we can look at your data. Okay, next slide, please, Lisa. Lisa briefly mentioned that not only do we monitor wetland birds, but we also monitor habitats. And this is something that might be important to you if you are a wildlife manager or a habitat manager. You might just be interested in it. But there's a lot of things that affect waterbird presence. So it could be things like water levels or storm surge or pollution or disturbance, these sort of things. And we do have a way to monitor this. And you don't have to do it this CWC if this is your first one, but we would love if one day you did download our site description forms for a site that you visit, and maybe each year you could fill one of these out. We're moving this online very soon, so it will no longer be paper forms, but this is a great way to sort of track habitat covariates over time at a wetland. So it's things like water levels, salinity, vegetation, what's happening there. Are people visiting it for recreation? Are they letting their animals graze there? Are there invasive predators like cats and mongoose, that sort of thing? And over time, we can paint a picture of waterbird abundance versus the different things happening at the site. So this is also part of the overall CWC program, and we just wanted you to be aware of it. Next slide, please. We have, if you haven't visited our website yet, please do. We have a ton of CWC resources available. And we'll also send an email to you with a bunch of links at the end of this. We do have, just on our main page on our menu, if you click on programs, Caribbean Waterbird Census is the first one that comes up in the menu bar, and that's sort of the landing page. And you can find detailed information about how to do account, everything we've gone over today. You can find links to the CWC manual, data sheets, instructions, and those screenshots for eBird Caribbean. Lisa's writing in the chat that our manual is available in English and Spanish. Reports we've written, blog articles, and so much more. But it's not limited to that. We also have other resources available, and we would love if you took advantage of them. We've just created, under our resource menu, the shorebird resources. Lisa mentioned earlier that shorebirds have a lot of focus because they're a group that's sort of declining globally. And we've created different sort of ID resources. This one we came out with this year during the global shorebird count in the fall, which is Common Caribbean Shorebird ID. It's a quick guide and sort of clues to help identify shorebirds. We also have gorgeous posters that you can download and print, which are on the next slide. And those are available in English, Spanish, and French. And the Spanish covers the common Spanish names in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the DR. And our resources are not limited to these. We have many things that are all free to download. There's also educational resources and coloring books for kids. So please, if you just want to spruce up your office and print some beautiful shorebird resources, or you want to share them, or you are an educator and want to engage kids, please visit that site. We worked hard to create all of these. And then if you have an idea in the future of some resources that we're missing or something that would be really helpful to you, please let us know. And we can always create something with input. Okay, so next, I'm excited to talk with you about sort of some results of the first 10 years of the CWC. I will say that this slide is preliminary numbers, and we're working right now on writing a comprehensive report for the first 10 years from 2010 to 2020. And so actually the numbers are different than this, but this just gives you a ballpark. But we've just had a ton of CWC checklists on eBird, over 10,000 checklists over the past 10 years. This is more than 1 million birds were counted. Over 350 people have participated. It's probably closer to more than 400. A lot of species reported, 505 species in the Caribbean on our CWC checklist, which is awesome. There's been 90 important bird areas visited, and the CWC has taken place at over 1,700 unique sites, which is really incredible. And so looking at a map of the Caribbean and where these have taken place, this is a map over the last 10 years of where CWC checklists have been reported. And then they sort of vary by color and size for how many checklists have taken place in those areas. So some of those black dots, there's only been one CWC checklist. And then as they get bluer and larger, there's been a lot more. And so that is sort of the repeated counts and the visiting every year that Lisa was talking about earlier. And we really love to see that, because then we can get an idea of bird distribution and abundance over time. Next slide, please. Great. So there's been a ton of participation, as you can see by the map on the previous slide. People at all different levels. I mean, it can just be individuals. Some people go out as part of their jobs, part of their nonprofit or their government work. But really, all across the Caribbean, people have been helping us gather CWC data. And it's also a great way to engage the community. While people do it as part of their profession, next slide, please. It's also a great way for educators to introduce the community and also school children to the CWC program, why birds are important, why wetlands are important. And it's really just a great way to spend a day outside. And then you can teach all of this environmental education alongside a CWC count, which is really great. And if you need more information on any of these things, or are interested in doing one of these things on your island or with a group, please contact me or Lisa. We wanted to quickly tell sort of two stories of two areas that are big CWC areas for us in the Caribbean, which have different but interesting stories. The first is the Cargill salt ponds in Bonaire. And this is, on the left is a map of Bonaire, and you can see that the whole southern part of the island, which is zoomed in on the right, is a salt facility that Cargill owns. Next slide, please. And when Lisa was visiting the area for a wetland training, excuse me, the manager at Cargill said, "Hey, I have a lot of shorebirds here at my facility, and why don't you come take a look?" And she went there and saw this fantastic amount of shorebirds and said, "Oh my goodness, this is so incredible." And of course it was a private facility. And so the information was sort of, it wasn't public to visit or public to do counts or that sort of thing, but Cargill has been very great over the years, and CWC monitoring began in 2015. It's still ongoing. And it became very clear very quickly that a lot of different shorebirds and large number of shorebirds use this site. And so recently in 2018, as Lisa said, It was designated a Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network site in 2018. This is only the second site in the Caribbean. The first is Cabo Rojo in Puerto Rico, which was designated in 2010. And this requires a certain criteria to be met in order to receive this designation. So it received the designation based on having more than 20,000 shorebirds a year. Based on the CWC data, it was estimated that about 32,000 shorebirds used the area in January and February of 2015. And that was 15 different shorebird species, which is amazing. And it also hosted more than 1% of the geographic population of 3 different birds, the short-billed dowitcher, the rufous subspecies of the red knot, and also the snowy plover. So that's very great, and you can read about the story on our blog. And we're continuing work at Cargill right now. So Fernando and his team, who have been working with us over the years, are measuring habitat covariates, so salinity, water depth, the things that we were talking about before in the site description forms, and also invertebrate sampling. And also, we've received some really great funding recently in the past year from Cargill and both the Canadian Wildlife Service for enhanced birding sites across Bonaire, which is great. And so we hope to build a bird observation tower with interpretive signs overlooking part of the Cargill property, and also doing the same thing, creating blinds and interpretive signs at different wetland sites in Bonaire. So that's really great. We have a lot of momentum there in Bonaire, which is fantastic. And it's thanks to the CWC. The next site is Monte Cristi in Dominican Republic. And I was very excited to see that Maria Paulino, who is one of our champions of the Dominican Republic and an all-star CWC survey person, is on the call today. Monte Cristi is a really special site. It's in the north of Hispaniola, just on the border of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which you can see on this map. Our local partner that works there is Grupo Acción Ecológica. Next slide, please. And surveys at Monte Cristi began in 2011 and they're ongoing. Maria's, I know she's out there. She's sending me her checklists all the time. And the condition of the sites is variable. It's a huge mixed use wetland site. So you can see sort of 2 of the different habitat types here. One, you can see sort of some pollution and disturbance. Obviously human interference doesn't stop all the ducks from being in that wetland though. And then other more natural areas like the one on the right. These are both from Monte Cristi. And there's high abundances of both shorebirds and waterfowl. This slide just shows one example of a multi-day survey. So certainly it's very hard to cover this entire area in one day. So they'll go there and spend 3 days surveying different sites. And in November of 2013, over those 3 days, their team saw over 17,000 shorebirds, which is incredible, and over 6,000 different types of ducks. So as Lisa said, blue-winged teal is the Caribbean's most abundant duck, and they counted, their raw count was over 4,000 of those. A ton of different shorebirds, more than 5,000 black-necked stilts, 3,200 lesser yellowlegs, 3,100 semi-palmated sandpiper. It's really incredible what's going on there. And as sort of a non-quantitative role that the CWC plays in understanding what's happening in Caribbean wetlands, their team has also observed illegal trapping. And so this is some pictures that their team has sent us. And we can see that these are sort of snare traps. They're like a fishing line or like a microfilament that is tied to a stake, and the traps are placed at low tide. And then when the tide rises, the snares are hidden, and then when the birds are walking around and foraging in the shallow water, it snares their feet. And so the team is persistent about seeing these traps and removing them. This past year, they removed over 650 traps during their visit. The year before that, they removed over 300 traps. You can see a member of the group here freeing a flamingo. There's also a dead heron or egret. And this is something that our CWC teams this is a non-quantitative outcome that is so important for understanding what's happening in Caribbean wetlands. And their teams do report these to the relevant authorities. In many cases, there's not a lot of enforcement, but we're persistent with it. And hopefully we will see less illegal trapping in the future. So thank you, Maria, and your team for your hard work. There's always something happening with CWC. In 2019, we recently had a workshop in Cabo Rojo, Puerto Rico, which was amazing. We had 33 participants from 14 islands. I see a lot of you guys are on the call today, so hello. And I hope that you're gonna go out at the end of this month and count some birds. And a great thing about this workshop was that participants were able to apply for small grants to conduct CWC monitoring and shorebird conservation activities on their islands. And so those are ongoing, which is fantastic. We also have ongoing collaboration with Canadian Wildlife Service and the US Fish and Wildlife Service. Examples of these are piping plover surveys, which unfortunately the International Piping Plover Census for this year was postponed because of the pandemic. But those surveys are revealing these really important wintering sites across the Caribbean for piping plovers like Turks and Caicos, Cuba, the Bahamas, Puerto Rico. So that is ongoing. We also have CWC surveys in Barbados and Puerto Rico happening this year, which is fantastic. And as I said before, the development of Bonaire's birding sites, especially their wetland sites. At the end of the summer, early fall, a new paper was published in PeerJ, which is part of my PhD work, and it identified important shorebird conservation areas in the Caribbean using eBird data. And of course, CWC data was a part of that. Please check it out. And we also we're working on right now, as I told you, a 10-year CWC report, which is coming this year, which is going to be amazing. And please, our 5-year report is on the internet and the links that we'll send you. But please stay tuned for this report because it's going to have a lot of valuable information about what birds are where, important sites, species profiles, site profiles. It's going to be very exciting when it comes out. And so I'm sure you probably gathered this from our presentation, but the CWC is so valuable. We're not only filling knowledge gaps about bird distribution and abundance, we're identifying sites like the site in Bonaire that qualify for special designations, other priority wetlands, and we're also engaging people across the region, which is just a really great way to connect people with nature and where they live. I hope that by now you know how you can participate in this year's CWC, which is coming up on January 14th through February 3rd. Really, you can go out on your own, grab a friend, whatever it is you need to do it safely. Choose a wetland to visit. Remember to pick the best time of day to go, where to count, which protocol to use. Highly recommend downloading the eBird mobile app. And then make sure that you include a CWC protocol when you submit your data. And then it's not just now, it's not just the 14th through the 3rd. Please, whenever you're out and you visit the site again, think about doing a CWC count, think about doing it a couple times a year. And that would be very, very helpful to us, to the birds and the wetlands. We will email you this since you registered, but we wanted to just share some resources and useful links. So we will email these links out to you guys at the end, which is all of our CWC information, our shorebird resources, how to access BirdsCaribbean, the CWC manual, all of that. And we also strongly encourage you to join our mailing list so that you can be automatically updated when we have exciting news to share. And some exciting news is that next week, as part of the launch of the CWC, we have 2 awesome Waterbird ID webinars. They are on Tuesday and Thursday next week at 4 p.m. Eastern time, the same time as today's webinar. And the first one will be IDing herons, egrets, ducks, marshbirds, and seabirds. That's on Tuesday. And on Thursday, probably the toughest group to ID in the winter in the Caribbean is shorebirds. That's why they get their own webinar. And Jeff Gerbracht, who's our resident bird ID expert, will be sharing all the tips and tricks and photos and sounds and different ways that you can brush up on your ID skill for these birds. So please keep those webinars in the back of your mind. We hope to see you there. They're for all levels of birders. You don't have to be a beginner. We all learn new things at these webinars. So we can't wait to see you next week too. We did have some questions. I see one from Jean in our Q&A, and then I also saw one that I don't want to miss in our chat from Susan Davis. So Susan asked, when we were talking about level 1 and level 2 protocols, she asked, do we have to tag it level 2 in eBird? And do you want to answer about the actual level of protocols are not stored in eBird? And there's no way to differentiate like a level 1 or a level 4 count in eBird. You can certainly write that in your checklist comments, which are, when we download the data, we pull that too. So you can put it there. Those protocols are generally, they're very helpful to us, but they're also helpful if you're analyzing your own data about a site. You want to add anything to that, Lisa?
Yeah, that was good. I would say if you want to do a level 2 count, that you're like maybe doing repeated counts, you're going out and counting a site, 2 or 3 times in a week or 10 days, that's great. Go ahead and enter it in eBird. I would recommend that you also maybe consider using data sheets, because on the data sheets for each count, you can record your habitat covariables, and then they can go into Excel, and then somebody can analyze them someday. So hopefully, like even by this summer, possibly eBird may have the ability to enter these habitat covariates. So again, it might be, you'll be able to just upload your Excel spreadsheet that has the habitat data, the weather, the water levels, maybe just some basic things that would correlate with bird ID. And then that will make your analysis much more powerful. You'll be able to analyze how numbers are changing over time eventually, and what factors are affecting that change, whether it is, storms and hurricanes or something happening at the site. So again, if you want to do level 2 counts, I recommend that you use the data sheets as well, or a notebook to enter your habitat covariates, and then keep track of that and get it into an Excel file. And we'd be happy to chat with you a little bit more, one-on-one about how you can do that most easily. Any other questions?
Yeah, so Jean from our Puerto Rico workshop in 2019 asks, hi, to have better data for a huge wetland that has different habitats like salt flats, mud flats, ponds, with a high number of mangroves and even open areas, is it better to do a point count in every different habitat, or decide a different method for the different habitats that are sort of embedded within the complex?
That's a very good question.
That's an advanced question, Jean.
Yes. So eBird does recommend that if you switch habitats, you should do a different count in eBird. So don't go from a swamp habitat to a mud flat and keep using the same checklist, because again, yeah, the habitat is completely different. You're going to have different birds. So your data will be more valuable if you do a count in each different habitat type. And if it's a really large wetland or mudflat, you might have to do 3 or 4 or 5 point counts to cover it or more. And again, for statistical analyses, you want to try to do more counts than that even. And again, you would want to like do a sampling frame and like sample randomly or sample every 400 meters. That's what we did on the dikes in Cargill. We started a random point, but then did every 400 meters we did a count. Was a different count. So again, you want to think about how far can you see in the habitat. You might want to set 200 meters as the furthest distance that you'll count. So then if you have counts that are 200 meters apart, you won't be double counting birds. Sort of lots of little details like that to consider. But yeah, definitely change eBird checklist when you get to a different habitat.
Yeah, his question also included like if he was at a salt flat for one and then a mangrove for another, but they're part of sort of the same overall wetland, like maybe a point count might be more appropriate at one and then a traveling count at another. And is that okay?
Right. Yeah, that's okay. That's perfectly okay. Yep. Yep. You can have different kinds of counts within an area. So just, practice doing some counts at the site, decide what makes the most sense, by doing some practice, getting to know your site, getting to know the birds. Then once you decide, okay, yeah, this is the best way to count the site, then that's your protocol. And then you stick with it and you do it season after season, year after year. And then after 2 or 3 years, you're going to have some data that you can analyze. You can say, gosh, what happened to all the birds this year? We heard from a lot of people this year, shorebird numbers were down. And so, some of these people are gathering habitat data, and we're going to be able to look at that data and analyze why are numbers lower. Was it due to water levels? They got a lot of rain, or was it due to drought and the wetlands are dry? Things like that. So over time, the data becomes very valuable, especially when you gather that habitat data that's going to help you understand why bird numbers are going up and down. I had a bonus question. What bird is on my screen? I'll send a BirdsCaribbean buff to the first person that answers correctly.
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Yep, it's in its winter plumage, kind of a medium-sized shorebird, kind of a chunky body, big black eyes. Good job, Susan. All right, I'll send you something. You might already have a buff. Yep, good job. Chorlito, yep, that's a flubber. So yeah, we will invite you guys to be part of our waterbirdgroups.io if you're not already. We have a listserv or group. It used to be on Yahoo, but it changed in December to groups.io. But that's a great place to share information about your counts, what you're seeing. On our Facebook page, you could share birds that you have trouble identifying. Never be embarrassed to share with us a photo of a bird that you're not sure about. We share photos with each other all the time. Because birds can be challenging. All of a sudden they can just look different, or you see it all by itself. You have no way to compare its size with anything else. So you don't know what it is. Is it the size of a sandpiper? Is it a yellowlegs? So yeah, we're always all learning. So do share your photos with us. Take photos, don't guess. And then after you take our 2 webinars next week, if you're a beginning to intermediate birder, you'll really benefit from these bird ID presentations that Jeff will do. Good refresher course. He'll be sharing some new tips, tips that we've gathered from lots of birding, lots of talking to experts, stealing them from other shorebird webinars that birding experts give, things like that. Any more questions? Okay, well, if not, we thank you again for attending the webinar. We thank everybody that's already been participating in the CWC and the new people that will be joining. We're excited to have you join us. And we'll put our emails in the chat window. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send us a message. And again, by tomorrow, we'll send you those links that we had on our PowerPoint and links to download data sheets, things like that. All right, and thanks to Adrienne for doing the Spanish translation. Looks like you were keeping up, even though we were both talking pretty fast. Great job. So thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. Good luck with your counts if you're starting this weekend, and we will see you next week. Oh, and also, I think, did we forget to mention the webinar this Friday? That's in.
Oh, yes, there's a Puerto Rico specific webinar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's it is on our Facebook page, and we'll send that link to you as well. So if you're in Puerto Rico, that webinar is going to be in Spanish. I think Sergio Colon, who's a shorebird ID expert, is going to give that webinar. And Adrienne,
Colon, is it?
Friday at 3 p.m. in Puerto Rico time, 3 p.m., which is 4 p.m. for us. Yeah, Puerto Rico time. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us, and have a good evening, and we'll be in touch. Take care. Bye for now.